Hi guys, welcome back to a new video. Today we're going to be focusing on framing out, and I had this video in mind because I haven't been showing a lot of love to first speakers. So here's the video that should help first speakers. But this skill should be applied by any speaker because this happens during preps, and preps are what win debates. The motion for round 3 is as follows. And you hear either of these motions and you're on proposition side. So without the skill or ability to frame out in this motion, it might be really tricky. If you're against a really competitive team, you might find yourself in a losing round. So what exactly is framing out in a debate? The best way to think about framing out is when you narrow the debate without quote-unquote squirreling the debate. And squirreling is essentially when you run away from the point of the debate or debate on the least controversial grounds in the debate. For example, if the motion was this house would ban gambling and you framed the debate to say no, we would ban gambling in these specific scenarios, in these specific cases, then you're running away from the battleground of the debate, where the debate is supposed to take place, on the broader implications of what gambling is and the pros and cons of it. So, when you're framing debates though, what I've just said is that you want to avoid running away from the point of the debate. So what you're essentially doing is that you actually want to make debates more about the actual debate. In other words, you want to discuss the broader impacts, how it affects the real world, other than getting into like a back and forth about what is the definition of the debate. And oftentimes people get into this mistake when they don't frame specific things out. The debate just ends up about being something context related rather than how it affects the real world and the impacts that occur from the motion. Moreover, when framing out, the most important thing is that when you're framing out, you have to give legitimate reasons for why that is the case. In other words, you can't just say something isn't part of the debate or something isn't impacted in the debate just because you want to. You have to give genuine reasons and structural reasons for that case. Moreover, there are two ways that you can think about framing out in debates. The first way is discussing that, look, we aren't refusing to debate about a specific thing. You aren't fiating them out, but you're discussing and giving reasons for the fact that whatever you're framing out isn't impacted by the motion or isn't because of the motion that thing exists. Similarly, but a bit more difficult, you can find yourself in scenarios where you are genuinely just removing something from the debate because the debate doesn't call for it. How then do you frame out in debates? I think the first way and the most important way, and this may sound too simple, but most people don't really do this, is that when you get the motion and you're in prep time, the first few minutes of prep, which is usually strategy or for some teams is context, you are motion reading literally every single word in the motion. This house would, you look at the word would, you understand why that word is there. The importance of this is that once you're motion reading, you're able to state the implications of the motion, the type of motion it is, and the burdens of such a motion. For example, when you're reading and you see, oh, this house regrets, the first thing that quickly comes to your mind is that you are able to explicitly state that in a this house regrets debate, that it is a counterfactual debate, where you can say, look, here's the status quo, that's opposition side. Here's the counterfactual. We think it would have been better. Here's our stance. Similarly, you can clearly see what you just have to prove. Like in my previous video from the motion analysis series, you could clearly see I showed that in that world, people could still have a lot of wealth, but they didn't aspire to have a lot of wealth. There are keywords in every debate. For example, when editing the video, I realized that I went on a debate nerd tangent, but I'll just link the example that I was talking about in the link below. And the example that I was referring to was from the 2016 WUDC final, and it can be seen in the first speaker's speech. When the motion's specified, justified, rather than looking at the end outcome. It's these little things that people overlook when reading the motion, and that's why most people miss the motion in the first place. So this is kind of like another lesson of how to frame, but also how to frame out. The second way is literally just being clear and showing the judges what you stand for and what you don't stand for. Sometimes in debates that are quite tricky or sound like you're on the quote-unquote wrong side or the more quote-unquote controversial side, sometimes you genuinely have to be clear on what you stand for and what you don't stand for. For example, if a debate talked about having existing restrictions on right-wing populists and you're on the opposition side saying that you want to remove those restrictions, you can be clear that you don't stand for hate speech because that's a crime and you aren't obligated to defend hate speech, but you still would lift restrictions that exist for right-wing populists. The third way that you can frame out is just being clear on what is and what is not the comparative. So this can come in many ways. You can show which actor that you're actually talking about in the debate. You can talk about what type of motion the debate is about and what that calls for. For example, there may be a narrative and you say that people don't actually act on this narrative. This narrative acts as a motivational thing for maybe, let's say, people that are in the motion. Maybe there's a specific characteristic that you want to remove from the model because let's say that isn't maybe how the debate is supposed to be played out. So you're establishing what is part of the debate and what isn't on both sides of the world. The last bullet point I mentioned that you have to give reasons for anything you do. So there are other intuitive ways that you can frame out. And these can come, like I said, again, maybe you're framing out an actor or a specific thing in a model. And you have to give structural reasons for this. You can't just say that thing isn't part of the debate. By structural reasons, I mean that everything operates a specific way. Companies work a specific way. Narratives work a specific way. By structural reasons, you are assessing the nature of that thing and you're saying this is the way they work and this is why this isn't part of the debate. For example, if you're talking about, let's say, a narrative about love, maybe the people that are married don't need to care about this narrative because they already access love in the first place. That's a structural reason because narratives like that probably appeal more to single people or people that aren't married yet or people that don't access love in the first place. But other ways that you can give reasons is, like I said, just state how maybe debating motions work. This house regrets the other side can't put a new model. They have to defend a status quo, not a new counterfactual, for example. That's our side's job. We're proposition, for example. You have to give reasons. You have to show the judge exactly what you're doing and why you're doing that specific frame out. Hopefully now you have a better understanding of how to frame out, and you could probably attempt and think of some very controversial things that could come up in these two motions. So I'm going to pause the video here and just think about certain ways or certain problems that could arise, and I'll give my interpretations of certain things that you can frame out in each motion and some mistakes I've made in the past. So my editing software is probably going to run out of space if I give more time. So you can just pause the video here. I don't think I'd be able to do it in 20 seconds. I would also need more time if I were in your position as the viewer of this video. So you can just pause the video. But back to the video. On the first motion, this house supports dark comedy from minority comedians. We had a similar motion to this last year at Nationals. And I don't want to say my team didn't effectively do this with what I'm about to say, but we low-key didn't, because one of the most valuable lessons I got from my coach last year at Nationals was that if you felt you were quote-unquote robbed, you probably didn't effectively convey what you wanted to convey to a judge, and that's how debating works. But enough of debate lessons. So what we did last year was that we wanted to frame out racist jokes in dark comedy, and we said that because firstly, hate speech is a thing, constitutionally it isn't allowed. Secondly, if it's very offensive, then you won't have any viewers. That's how like comedians make money. The more viewers you have, the more appeal that you have. And there were other analysis that I forgot. And now that I think about it in retrospect, and even seeing other debates where it has worked out with similar motions, I don't think that's the most effective thing to frame out, because that's the whole essence of the debate to a large extent. I think the better thing to frame out is, oftentimes opposition would be in a situation where they say new stereotypes or stereotypes are perpetuated from these comedians. And I think the most important thing and the most effective thing that I didn't say earlier on in this video is that sometimes framing out can be done, by showing that something isn't inherent to the motion. And I think a better frame out that we should have done to this motion was framing out that oftentimes stereotypes and like racist jokes, for example, very offensive um, like things don't originate from minority comedians. And there are a few reasons you can give. For example, the majority of people that are in the minority probably had this because they were probably like racist back in the day. Or you could say standards that existed. For example, if they're like maybe beauty standards, for example, that are perpetuated, and let's say a minority comedian makes those jokes, it's advertisers, it's companies, it's corporations that made it. Or more than others, it's probably just parents who are telling their children, for example, these jokes. Maybe they come from the majority and they pass on these offensive jokes, rather. I mean, not jokes, I used the wrong word, offensive characteristics or offensive things, and they tell this to their children. Thus, I think the better thing to do in this debate is just to frame that things like racism do not originate from minority comedians. They probably pick up on these things and make jokes about it. On the second motion, this House believes that news outlets should always portray pandemics optimistically. I think the most obvious scary thing about this motion is the word always, because now you're talking about a scary time, such as a pandemic, and now you have to always, like every single time, portray it as some positive thing, or at least portray positive things that are happening during this pandemic. And I think the most important thing to frame out in such a debate is optimistic portrayal in media does not necessarily mean complacency. In other words, that the message that you want to spread out when portraying the pandemic doesn't mean that you're only showing the positives in a way that now you can, let's say, stop wearing a mask or stop taking vaccines because good efforts and positive efforts are like happening. Rather, it's just showing like the progress that you're doing and the positivity that is coming out of such a difficult time. However, you're still going to have a portrayal of a need for continued efforts. And you have to give structural reasons for this, especially because this House believes that motion. So you don't have to fiat to just be like, look, this is how it's going to operate. And a few reasons you can definitely give here is, number one, media outlets have incentives in probably solving the pandemic, and that's why they're portraying it in the first place. So they are aware that they don't want people to become overly optimistic. Moreover, you can probably also talk about counter activism, where, for example, other journalists can discredit this outlet if they are not paying very close attention, for example, to the need for continued efforts, and maybe are just overly overly showing optimistic like things in this debate. So I thought it would be beneficial to go through a few more examples. So in this next motion, this House regrets the narrative that religious leaders have a deeper connection with their deities. And I remember in this motion, which was in last year's provincials, where my team did win provincials and we also won this round. And during prep, I had this intuition that there may be a huge misconception coming out of opposition side, which we were going up against a very strong team. But I brought up this idea that there may be a misconception of this debate alongside my brilliant teammates, and I was giving the proposition first speech. And I made it clear that this debate should not have a misconception around the fact that like average day-to-day citizens who are religious have a connection with their deities. Similarly, also religious leaders having some sort of connection with their deities. This debate is specifically about them having a deeper connection with their deities, and the two should not be confused because the motion clearly states the word deeper. And I think that was very important because opposition one probably already had all these fancy arguments prepped out, but for the wrong debate, which they did. And our proposition second speaker and our proposition third speaker called it out. And like I said, debates are won in prep because we had a full hour to think about this. The other team had to adapt on the spot. So that was a very good frame out that we did. And I don't even want to call it a frame out per se, but because that was framing out that part of the debate where maybe that is a thing, but like I said, this was the other way of showing frame outs where it may exist, we could probably debate about it, but this motion does not impact those actors having some sort of connection at all. So with this next motion, which was also in our provincials last year, it was something like this, but it was about new medical medicines being produced, and randomly people would have to go or undergo mandatory clinical trials. And we framed out that people wouldn't be harmed in this process, well, at least to a large extent. And this was like the first minute of my speech when setting up the model. And the reason for this was a few reasons. I think the first reason was along the lines of having preclinical testing, where drugs undergo extensive testing in laboratories and even on animals, for examples, before being introduced to humans. Moreover, we also said in the worst case scenario, something were to go wrong, these do occur under controlled environments, so clinical trials occur where there are a lot of professionals closely monitoring them. The last reason, which I think was quite niche and kind of cool, we said that most medicines that occur today, because the motion at the time had the specific word new medicines in this day and age, and we clearly stated that medicines have gone through so much development, all the framework for theory that undergoes maybe a new antibiotic undergoes other theory that have already been established and other framework for existing medication, and maybe this is just an update. So we showed, because there have been such developments and such a strong established framework of making medication, and that the kind of medicines that do exist in maybe this type of debate or the newer medicines are just updates maybe to resistance to antibiotics, to the point where most new medications probably don't have any or huge side effects because they've already been that developed up until this point. It's just small incremental like changes to that medicine. So that's the video, guys. I'm sure a key takeaway that you may have gotten from this video is that frameouts can also be used to effectively set up a debate to avoid misconceptions and just strenuous contextual issues up until the third speech. So thank you guys for popping by. Stay tuned for more videos.